Coming to you entirely pre-recorded from the Garage of Solitude here in Whitestone, Queens, I am Mario-Francisco Robles, and this is episode 6 of the Superman on Film podcast. Welcome to the show, ladies and gentlemen. It is my pleasure to start the show off with the usual countdown update. We are currently 47 weeks away from the arrival of James Gunn's Superman. 47 weeks until the Man of Steel flies once again to the big screen and hopefully kicks off a very, very successful DC on film franchise, which is something Superman has not been able to claim for several decades now. So here we go. Let's dive right on in and start things off, as we always do, with the Superman on film update for this week. So right now, as I stated last week, the updates are going to be a little bit threadbare because James Gunn is currently working on post-production on the film, and there aren't any interviews taking place. There's no set picks to discuss. Right now, things are a little radio silent when it comes to the production, so the updates are going to be a little bit minimal for the next foreseeable future. But for right now, let's go ahead and talk about what has happened this week. This week, Sean Gunn at last confirmed his casting as Maxwell Lord in Superman and in the DCU in general. Maxwell Lord is going to be a villainous character that is probably going to factor in to several different projects across live action, across animation, across film and television. I suspect we're going to see a decent amount of Maxwell Lord as some sort of background, interesting, manipulating villain. Because if you'll recall, some of the early set pictures that we saw included characters like Hawkgirl and Mr. Terrific and Guy Gardner wearing suits that had the Lord Tech symbol emblazoned across them, almost as if Maxwell Lord's Lord Tech has its own corporate team of superheroes that Superman's going to have to deal with. People who are doing it perhaps as part of a government agency or as part of some sort of private army type of situation, an independent group of corporately sponsored superheroes. Whatever the case, we know Maxwell Lord is going to be factoring in somehow into James Gunn's Superman, and we've known for a while that Sean Gunn was going to be playing him. That's James's brother, who's appeared in several of his films. But this is the first time we got Sean Gunn on the record talking about what they're cooking up over there when it comes to Lord. So in terms of comments that were made this week over to The Wrap, Sean Gunn said, "I can't say that much other than we did talk about relevant materials and we discussed the character in detail before I dove in. We reference no live action performances of the character. It's all from written materials with things that we figure we're looking at." So that's interesting, right? Because Maxwell Lord has been attempted before. He's shown up on DC TV programs. In live action film, he showed up in Wonder Woman 1984, or I'm sorry, Wonder Woman, was it just Wonder Woman 84? I don't even remember anymore. That film was such a disappointment. I think I tried to knock it out of my mind the second the credits began to roll. But yes, Pedro Pascal played him, and I love Pedro. Pedro's the man. But he played Maxwell Lord in a film that I'm sure most people just wanted to forget afterward. So you wouldn't begrudge Sean Gunn for going, yeah, I'm not going to base my version of Lord on Pedro's version or the ones that we've seen on Supergirl or any other Arrowverse type of incarnation of Max Lord that we've seen. This will not be based on that, but rather, as with a lot of what James Gunn's working on, which I've discussed on this show, a lot of it seems to be coming directly from the comics. They're looking at the literary sources for a lot of these characters, kind of going to the roots of what makes these characters work and why they've existed at all for decades. And yes, they're going to the source material. So it is interesting to note, and it makes you wonder which stories involving Maxwell Lord do they consider their source material? What is the actual reference point? Which is the ideal, iconic version of Maxwell Lord that they plan on bringing to the big screen, that Sean Gunn plans on giving us? Or is he going to use the comics and create something very original that we haven't seen before? Because these Gunn brothers, they sure like to put their own twist on things. But we'll get to that concern of mine about Gunn twists actually in just a moment. For right now, the other bit of information, the other bit of news this week coming from James Gunn regarding possibly Superman, but definitely the DCU, is that he released this very interesting image. He just tweeted out an image of this very unique symbol with no words, no nothing. It's this symbol here that if you're watching the show on YouTube, I'm showing it on the screen. And it's a unique symbol, but if you are a DC fan, you look at that and you know, wait a minute, that is the Argus logo, ARGUS, Advanced Research Group Uniting Superhumans. That's right. And Argus is essentially the owner company for the Suicide Squad and other mercenary groups. They're kind of like the parent company in the comics. So you kind of get the sense, since James Gunn is currently working on Peacemaker Season 2. And Peacemaker centers on Task Force X, the Suicide Squad, Amanda Waller, all that stuff. I guess, especially with the way Season 1 wrapped up, it looks like we're going to get kicked up the chain of command a bit in that organization. And we're no longer going to be dealing with Amanda Waller as the main boss of things, but we're going to find out what her bosses think of what went on during Season 1's storyline. Because Amanda kind of lost control, if you'll recall. Things took some rather dark, twisted turns. So here we are. We're learning that Argus, ARGUS, will indeed factor into Peacemaker Season 2 and the DCU as a whole. So it's going to be very interesting to see what they do with them. And the other big bit of interesting news regarding the DCU and Superman in particular come by way of comments from Isabela Merced. Isabela is currently starring in Alien Romulus, which opened this past weekend, and she's out there doing interviews. And of course, if you are playing some kind of a superhero and you're out there promoting a movie, they are going to ask you about your superhero movie, because that gets lots of clicks, that gets lots of views, that gets lots of attention. So of course, Isabela was asked about what should we expect from James Gunn's Superman, what was it like working on it, and on the red carpet she said the whole movie is very loyal to the comic books, but with a James Gunn twist. I really think it's funny, it's clever, it's heartwarming. So, as you might expect, I like the heartwarming part of that quote. I feel like any good Superman story needs to be heartfelt. It needs to be heartwarming. But I got to be honest, some of the early stuff in that quote really kind of stresses me out a little bit. Because, the last thing I wanted to hear was funny. I don't want Superman to be a comedy. And the big concern when James Gunn was hired was, is he going to make it jokey and comedic? Right? Because we know the Guardians of the Galaxy movies all had a fair amount of humor. We know the Suicide Squad had a fair amount of humor. A little different, a little more grown up, a little edgier, but definitely had its own brand of humor in it. Then you have Peacemaker with its own twisted, dark, vulgar sense of humor, balanced out nicely by moments of great emotion and pathos and character development. And that's why I think Peacemaker, if you haven't seen it, you're sleeping on it. That is a very, very good series, and it is very much worth your time. But on that series, again, a heavily comedic touch throughout all of the stories. And early on, James Gunn was asked, is this going to be a comedy? And he said no. He said, this is not going, he said his Superman movie is not going to be like his previous films. He kind of made that promise that we shouldn't expect it to be like a Guardians movie. It's going to be its own thing. It's going to be what it needs to be. And yet, the very first words out of Isabella's mouth are funny and clever and a James Gunn twist. I don't want a twist. Give me a classic Superman story ripped right from the books that feels like a real adaptation of a timeless Superman adventure. I don't want some kind of reinvention of Superman. We've been getting reinventions a lot in the last 10, 15 years across different bits of medium. Everyone's trying to take a crack at modernizing and adapting Superman for a new audience. So I'm kind of up to here when it comes to twists. So hearing about a James Gunn twist worries me a little bit. Hearing about funny and clever worries me a little bit. But at the same time, she was just, making a quick off-the-cuff remark on the red carpet, and she was trying to throw together some nice things to say about her new boss and her new hopeful ongoing project. Because hopefully, if this all works out, she's going to be Hawkgirl for many, many years now. So listen, I'm not going to hang on every word she said, but I have some concerns. But okay, so it's just about time to get into this week's topic, and it makes me feel the need to remind you that you should be following me on Twitter, on Threads, on Instagram. You should be following Superman on Film across all social media, because this week's topic was actually voted on by Superman on Film followers over on X. I made a poll including 4 different options for topics for this week's show. And this week's topic that won by a fairly strong margin, although the second place one's going to have to get some play on next week's poll. But the one that won this week's poll was DCEU versus DCU, Dawn of the Future. And if you would like a chance to vote on future polls and have a chance to make your voice heard on what the next topic should be, or even just suggest future topics, I very much strongly suggest you follow Superman on Film on X, on Threads, on Instagram, and you will get to have your voice heard. But for right now, let's go ahead and dive on into this week's topic, shall we? Now, I imagine that one of the reasons that this won the poll is because right now, as a fandom, there is a little bit of a split. There is like an issue where you have a lot of fans who bought in heavily to what DC was from 2013 through 2022 and are still wishing that Warner Brothers had found a way to breathe fresh life into what had been established during those 9 years. There's still a fair amount of fans who are out there tweeting hashtags for things from the past, are still scratching their heads and sharing anger and hostility towards James Gunn for not continuing on with Henry Cavill as Superman. There's still just, there is a fair amount of division within the DC fandom, because you have the people who are still clinging to the past versus the people who are ready for the future, which is what the DCU is. And I feel like in order to kind of understand where we're at and where we're going, we got to talk the whole thing through. We got to have a nice little history lesson. We have to break this thing down from start to finish. And I have a feeling that if you listen to this episode, if you watch this episode and you hear me out, and by the end of it, you still wish the DCEU was trugging along somehow, I don't know what to tell you, because, well, you know what? I'll let the facts of the case speak for themselves. All right. So let's go just from the outset, from the very beginning. Let's just establish what even is the DCEU, right? The DCEU stands for the DC Extended Universe. And where did this name come from for the franchise? Did it come from within the studio? Is this the official marketing branding for the franchise? No. The DCEU name was coined by a writer for Entertainment Weekly, and he just referred to it that way because it seemed like the best way to describe it was an extension of DC Comics' literary branch. This is the extended universe over onto film. So DCEU became the nickname thanks to one journalist calling it that in a very reputable magazine at the time. And that name stuck in an unofficial capacity until Max came out in like 2020, 2021. Around then is when all of a sudden they adapted the official moniker DCEU and put that over all the DC movies on their library there. But so at a base level, the name was not an official name. And in terms of the films that it comprised, there are 16 movies that bear the distinction of being DCEU movies. All right. And let's go through them. The ultimate 16 movies were Man of Steel, Batman vs. Superman, Suicide Squad, Wonder Woman, Justice League Theatrical, Aquaman, Shazam, Birds of Prey, Wonder Woman 1984, there it is, 1984, Zack Snyder's Justice League, The Suicide Squad, directed by James Gunn. Black Adam. Shazam, Fury of the Gods. The Flash. Blue Beetle. And Aquaman 2. Those are the 16 film projects that would ultimately comprise the DCEU as we know it and as we knew it. Now, in terms of what is the DCU is the upcoming DC franchise that hasn't started yet. Yes, I know it may seem confusing because James Gunn and Peter Safran formed DC Studios in November. Nope, I'm lying to you. In October of 2022 is when they formed DC Studios, and they made it official just a few days after Black Adam hit theaters. So even though DC Studios has been around since the fall of 2022, obviously it takes time to create projects. You can't just announce it and go, okay, now here's a TV show and a movie directly from us. It takes time. And in fact, it's taking almost 2 years to get that first DC project because they were given the job in October of 2022, but the first DC Studios official project isn't until December of 2024. That's right, a full 26 months to mount the very first DC Studios project, which is the animated series Creature Commandos. Okay? That will be the very start of the DCU, and it will continue on into Superman on July 11th, 2025. But for right now, there is no DCU. And if a part of you has been trying to consider these movies that have come out since James Gunn got the job as DCU movies, well, you're confused, And listen, it's a natural thing, he's the boss. These movies are coming out after he was made the boss. So these are therefore his DC movies. And, you're going to see a bit of a recurring pattern here because James Gunn, like other previous stewards of DC on film, was brought on with a bunch of projects already either completed or close to completion or in some form of serious production already. It's not like he got the job with a clean slate. All right, here you go. Now you've got DC. There's no other DC stuff currently planned. Take your time and build us a new franchise. No, he takes over DC with 4 other movies already coming out. He takes over DC already being given a green light for Peacemaker Season 2, which was technically part of the DCEU. He'd already even been developing that Waller series before DC Studios was a thing. So when James Gunn and Peter Safran get this job, it is far from clear where to even start. Because you've got 6 or 7 different projects that are under your banner, because he also inherited those Elseworlds projects. He also inherited Matt Reeves' The Batman Season 2, which had already been greenlit. He'd also inherited Joker 2, because that had already been greenlit. So James Gunn and Peter Safran, they were given DC, but they were also given like 7 other projects to figure out what to do with now. And they couldn't come out and say, yeah, so listen, none of this stuff really matters, or only 2 or 3 of the things matter. The rest you can just ignore. We're going to find a way to retrofit some of the stuff we were already working on into the future, since I was already overseeing it. If I'm James Gunn, that's what I'm trying to say. But we're going to cancel all the other stuff that was teasing a future that we're not interested in pursuing anymore. In fact, we were given the job of forming DC Studios because Warner Brothers said, yeah, our current direction is a path to nowhere. Please help us, save us. You want to start from scratch? You think that's what it's going to take? Then here are the keys to the kingdom. Go start us from scratch. They couldn't come out and say that. They had to come out and say that all of these films coming out could somehow mean something. We have to say that Shazam! Fury of the Gods could somehow continue on. Remember, Zachary Levi was out there kind of making the claim that maybe him and his cast of characters, his Justice Society people, his Marvel family, Captain Marvel, Shazam family, they were out there making the case that they could continue, and James Gunn had to make it sound like they could continue. Because you know what? If Shazam 2 had somehow been a big hit, they would have had no choice but to continue. Just like if Black Adam had been a big hit, they would have had no choice to continue. But that didn't happen, right? But James Gunn had to allow that back door of a possibility for any of these DC movies that had already been in production. He had to give them a shot to succeed. And in order to do that, he has to say, go see them. They're great. And if they and they could factor into my future plans, but you got to go see them. You know, he has to say that. You know, and even with Blue Beetle, I mean, you know, Blue Beetle has the interesting distinction of it's not really tied to any one particular version of DC. You know, so that's in that one, James Gunn got himself into an interesting scenario where he had to say, like, Blue Beetle will be part of the DCU. This version of Blue Beetle will continue on. And again, he said that after Black Adam had bombed, after Shazam Fury of the Gods had bombed. You know, he already saw that, like, interest in DC is starting to crater. That finally all the chickens have come back to roost from all the years of executive mismanagement from Warner Brothers. This thing is collapsing hard and falling on its face. So let's go ahead and try to rescue Blue Beetle from that. And let's act like he could still definitely continue. You know, he had to go out there and do some PR. You know, he had to go out there and tell fans that there's a reason to go see these movies. But at the end of the day, there was probably going to always be very little likelihood that we ever saw any of these DCEU guys again from these unrelated films that were coming out in 2023. All right, so the DCEU has not yet started. Yes, James Gunn has had a hand in making edits to the 4 DC movies that came out after he was hired. He had to go and make sure that we're not teasing things that are no longer going to happen. You know, because The Flash, while The Flash was always going to be some kind of a course correction, a soft reboot for DC on film, even the thing that it was going to set up was no longer what James Gunn wanted. You know, he wasn't there for any stage of the Flash's development. That's a project that's gone through so many evolutions since it was first announced way back in October of 2014. You know, James Gunn wasn't there for any of the twists and turns and trials and tribulations. By the time he got the job, the Flash was already pretty much, it was done. They were in post. But he saw where they were going. And he saw that there were like 2 or 3 potential endings for this thing. And he went ahead and made one that made the film just sort of stand on its own. It ends. There's no great tease of where we're going to go next. And in the process, he probably neutered The Flash a little bit. Let's be honest. DC Studios is probably one of the reasons that The Flash ended up not being a very great movie. You know, there was, you could see it. Like, you know, and I've always claimed this. I think The Flash has way more in common with the 2017 Justice League theatrical cut than anyone cares to want to admit or realize. You know, we all have accepted by now that the 2017 Justice League was a huge failure, that they totally, you know, they overwrote it, they edited it to hell, they committed atrocities to Superman's face, they made so many baffling decisions that, you know, it was so obvious that Justice League had been completely turned to nothing of what it was originally going to be, and it was hastily thrown together. And mind you, I still think it works surprisingly well considering how obviously haphazard it is. But I think The Flash has a lot in common. If you look really closely, you can tell there were whole subplots cut out of this. You could tell, oh, this was reshot. His hair looks totally different from this angle. It's kind of like when Ben Affleck was, like, you know, in great shape from certain camera angles and then chubby in others in the Justice League theatrical cut. Like, there's stuff like that in Andy Muschietti's The Flash. You can tell that movie was tinkered with to hell. But, again, if you're James Gunn, you had to make these tweaks. You had to do this tinkering because you already knew that this DCEU is on its dying days. It's on its last breaths. The experiment of continuously trying to breathe fresh life into this dead Frankenstein's monster is not paying off. So we have to sever ties and just start fresh. So he made some unfortunate decisions, and I'm sure it hurt the Flash. And I think, honestly, that's why he gave Andy Muschietti Batman the Brave and the Bold. He probably knows, man, we totally messed up your movie, but there was a very special movie in there, and you do have the goods to tell a great DC story on film. So I tell you what, we screwed up your Flash movie, but we'll give you Batman the Brave and the Bold. How about that? And I think that's why Andy Muschietti is one of the only DCEU creatives who's carried over. It's him. It's Christina Hodson from The Flash also. Another one who may have, there's a bit of an apology involved, right? Because she was involved with DC for a while. She helped write Birds of Prey. She helped write The Flash. She was even working on a Supergirl thing, if I'm not mistaken. Or was it Batgirl? She was heavily involved with several different DC projects before they canceled Batgirl and neutered The Flash and completely changed courses. And I feel like James Gunn saw, listen, she's got the goods. She seems to understand how to adapt these characters. But, we're going to have to put her talents in a different place now because the stuff she was working on before, we are not continuing on with, So Christina Hodson, Andy Muschietti, they stuck around, and let's see, hopefully, what they're able to create in a situation now where they're working with James Gunn and DC Studios from the outset. The vision is clear from the outset. Let's see what they can create together now, But now, okay, so we talked about what is the DCEU, what is the DCU, and now let's go all the way back to the beginning, okay? How did the DCEU get started, okay? Now, the question may seem, the answer may seem obvious, right? Because Man of Steel is the first DCEU movie, right? So you would not be wrong for assuming that that's the right answer. That's where the DCEU really begins. But in actuality, it's not the case. Because remember, as covered on last week's episode, Rebooting Superman, Man of Steel was not a world-building film. Christopher Nolan was heavily involved with the picture, and he was not really into the whole shared universe, crossover, there's a million superheroes and we're going to make Justice League alien invasion movies. He didn't want to go that far with all this. He was always much more involved in telling intimate, interesting stories that only lock in on the main character of that story being told. That's why he kept Batman on his own for the Dark Knight trilogy. That's why when Man of Steel, if you pay attention, Man of Steel has hardly any teases for the future. There's a little visual reference to Blaze Comics that Zack Snyder threw in there. There's the satellite with the Wayne Enterprises logo. There's a there's a Lex Luthor Corp thing thrown in there. But there's no flat out seeds planted. There's nothing at the end of that movie that makes you go, oh, wow, okay, now we got to see where they go with that thing. Man of Steel ends. It has a full beginning, middle, end, and no real teases of the future. So that's why I say Man of Steel cannot really be considered the start of the DCEU. The start of the DCEU came after the film was released, because it was during that period, that summer following Man of Steel's release, where Christopher Nolan bowed out. David Goyer did some of his final bit of DC work for DC on film, where he had helped Snyder come up with the idea for a Batman versus a Superman movie and came up with the initial sort of story outline, but he also kind of disappeared, and all of a sudden DC on film became a Zack Snyder joint. it became the Snyderverse, where Greg Silverman and the executives involved at Warner Brothers Pictures at the time looked at Man of Steel, looked at the current cinematic superhero landscape and said, you know what? We're going to let Zack Snyder engineer and architect for us an alternative brand to Marvel. Marvel is bright and colorful and family friendly, and it comes from Disney. We're going to let Zack Snyder tell more, dark, gritty, edgy, more grown-up, mature stories with our DC universe. After all, our Dark Knight trilogy brought all kinds of street cred from all over Hollywood. The Dark Knight was nominated for an Academy Award. So let's lean into that prestige. Let's make superhero movies that are geared towards adult audiences and that tackle headier concepts that are more just complicated, complex, metaphysical, mythological, epic things, so that it'll be the complete opposite of what the Marvel Cinematic Universe is doing. So as such, Zack Snyder, Deborah Snyder, using on the bones of the original Batman versus Superman plan, in 2014, they announced the arrival of a whole new slate of films that got announced. All right. In October of 2014. Okay. There was, I'm going to share with you the original slate of movies that was announced way back then. Are you ready? They announced that in 2016, we were going to get Batman versus Superman and Suicide Squad. Then in 2017, we were going to get Wonder Woman and Justice League. Then in 2018, we were going to get The Flash and Aquaman. Then in 2019, we were going to get Shazam and Justice League 2. Then in 2020, we were going to get Cyborg and Green Lantern. Okay? So those films were all announced a year and change after Man of Steel came out. And it was part of just a brain trust of Warner Brothers executives, Zack Snyder and Deborah Snyder, as well as writer Chris Terrio. Ben Affleck brought Chris Terrio onto the Batman versus Superman project to rewrite it because he wasn't too happy with the initial script, with the initial draft of things that David Goyer had given. He didn't think it was strong enough, and he thought his writer from Argo, Chris Terrio, should come take a crack at it and add those extra layers that are going to make this movie that much better. A modern, superhero classic, right? So they bring in Chris Terrio to write. And in this time, I should also mention there was even a delay, because when Batman versus Superman was first announced, it was going to be for July of 2015. And there was a delay, and it was part of that delay where all these films suddenly were born. Okay? You could tell that they had sort of jumped the gun on announcing the Man of Steel sequel for July of 2015. And they felt like, no. We need to take a little bit more time and come up with a fully comprehensive plan. This is going to be our Marvel killer. Let's go announce a big crazy slate of all of our DC projects, So that's where they were at. That's what they announced. The brain trust was just that. The brain trust, the creatives behind everything, was mainly Snyder as the architect, and then Warner Brothers executives announcing release dates and titles before anything had ever actually been entered into production. Before scripts were set, before casts were made, they announced this massive, super aggressive, super ambitious slate in the fall of 2014. And some very interesting stories started coming out around this time because, look, they announced all these films, so obviously casting had to begin. And yet Snyder, as the main architect, since his stuff was coming up first, basically Snyder got to cast everyone and set the blueprint for all these characters and heroes before any other directors would even get a chance to do it, because other directors were brought on board. Seth Grahame-Smith was brought on to direct that Flash movie that was supposed to be coming out in 2017. You know, Michelle McLaren had been hired to direct the Wonder Woman that was coming out in 2017. You know, so they had already started putting putting the creatives together. But at the same time, you heard interesting stories about Ezra Miller being cast as the Flash before even knowing that there even was a Flash movie. He never auditioned. I'm sorry, they never auditioned for it. There's a famous story where they were on a vacation in Costa Rica at some country club. They had instructed their agents and their managers and everyone to like, hold all my calls. I need a break from Hollywood. I'm going to go veg out on the beach for a while. When suddenly a call comes in that, hey, you have to take this. And Ezra took the call, I think, in the hotel lobby, going, Ezra, Zack Snyder wants to cast you as the Flash. And Ezra's like, what's the Flash? You know? So Zack Snyder was given basically the free reign to just decide who he wants to play who. And he was setting the tone for what all these other directors would sort of have to be forced to create under. You know, granted, he preached a message of, director freedom and everyone's going to get to do whatever they want. And, in the years to come, he would talk about he was really mainly focused on what was going to be his 5-story arc, his 5-film arc. And he was going to try to leave enough wiggle room for other DC creators to make interesting films that work within his 5-story arc. But ultimately, let's see how that worked out, okay? Because when Batman vs. Superman was about to come out, trouble began to arise, okay? We started hearing some interesting PR about how well the movie's being received. We heard about a big standing ovation that a screening had gotten, that executives had stood up and cheered for Ben Affleck because they thought, man, this Batman versus Superman movie, this is going to do it. This is our franchise starter. It's got a great name even. It's Batman versus Superman, Dawn of Justice. See, we're going to tell everyone that this is how we're getting to a Justice League movie. So, man, this is going to be great. And we started hearing interesting bits of hype, at the end of 2015 and at the early stages of 2016, that this movie is going to be an instant classic. We have another Dark Knight on our hands. And yet, you don't mess with something that's great, right? Well, they messed a lot with Batman versus Superman. Because by the time that film arrived in March of 2016, the studio had already cut out a good 30 minutes from the movie, kind of re-edited the film to make it shorter and hopefully more profitable. And behind the scenes, they had already started overhauling the Justice League plans. Now, were they delaying Justice League? No. They were still planning on entering production 1 month after Batman vs. Superman came out, but did that stop them from trying to rewrite the script and try to change the overall feel and tone of the Justice League movie that Zack Snyder had already been told he could make? In fact, he'd been told he could make 2. They had announced Justice League 1 and 2, and all of a sudden they said, never mind 2. We're just making 1 Justice League movie for now. And, the behind the scenes tweaks were already happening. But March of 2016, Batman vs. Superman arrives. It's the very first official movie that is part of this expanded universe that Snyder has been trying to build out since the summer of 2013. And how did it do? Well, on Rotten Tomatoes, it got a very unfavorable 29% critical response. It got a cinema score that was on par with the Green Lantern movie that had bombed and the Catwoman movie that had bombed. And even though it opened to a very respectable $166 million, by weekend 2, it suffered a historic drop. In fact, even in its opening weekend, the Friday to Sunday drop was really, really notable. It seemed like a lot of people showed up with a lot of curiosity on Friday night, And by Sunday, everyone who had seen it was like, don't bother. You know, the word of mouth had already started to shoot the film down within its first weekend. And by the time we got to weekend 2, it had nearly a 70% drop off. This was not the big world-starting, franchise-beginning kickoff of the DCEU that Warner Brothers had hoped. It just simply wasn't. And only 1 month later, this is something that I still can't fully wrap my head around. Seeing this data, obviously knowing that they had an issue on their hands, they push right forward into Justice League, which went before cameras in April of 2016. They began filming it. Okay? And what happened though? In May, only a couple of months after Batman vs. Superman came out, there was a big shakeup of executives over at Warner Brothers. And they decided DC needs a new leader. It needs a fresh coat of paint. It needs a total kind of branding rehaul. So in May of 2016, that's when Jeff Johns and John Berg were announced as the new leaders of DC Films, and that they were going to oversee everything moving forward, and they were going to usher in an era of fun and optimism and joy for our DC on film characters. And they got this job because they had been the ones overseeing the overhaul these months leading up to it. You know, they were the ones helping to chop up Batman versus Superman. They were the ones helping to recut and realign David Ayer's Suicide Squad movie. And since at the time, Warner Brothers thought we need to move away from the Snyder aesthetic, from the more grungy David Ayer aesthetic, let's just hand the keys of the kingdom over to Johns and Berg. Let's take it away from Snyder and let's let Johns and Berg take over. But, stop me if you've heard this one before, were they able to now hit pause on everything and get a chance to now unveil their version of DC and give audiences a chance to perhaps recover from Batman versus Superman and what would become of Suicide Squad? Were they given that chance to really fix DC on film? No. Just like with James Gunn years later, they were given a DC that already had a series of films that were already being filmed, that were already in some stage of production, and they were going to have to somehow realign these movies with the new vision and somehow edit them and tweak them even though the trains have already left the station. Can you imagine trying to tweak a movie that's already in production? Sets have been built, costumes designed, actors cast. We've worked out filming locations. All the logistics that go into making a movie have happened on all these films. Because when they took over, Wonder Woman was still on the way. Aquaman was still on the way. There was still, there were projects that were still in development. The Flash was still getting figured out. Because also, I should mention, that in the background of all this, after Batman vs. Superman came out and the studio went into full panic mode about DC on film, directors began to bolt. Remember I mentioned Seth Grahame-Smith for The Flash? He was gone. Remember Michelle McLaren for Wonder Woman? She left too. Everyone started to get the hell out of Dodge as soon as everyone heard what was going on with Batman versus Superman, when they started hearing about the ineptitude of Warner Brothers' plan for saving DC. All of a sudden, there was a bit of a panic going on. So Johns and Berg get the job, but they still have to make sure that Wonder Woman and Justice League and Aquaman and The Flash and Shazam all get the proper attention that they need. But they're not going to be allowed to delay or cancel anything. At this point, the only things that had been taken off of the slate were the Justice League 2 bit and the Flash. Flash had been reconfigured into Flashpoint because, again, by summer of 2016, they already knew we need to reboot. So let's just use the Flash movie and his Flashpoint storyline as a soft reboot because DC is in trouble. All right. So they were able to take the Flash off the schedule. They were able to take Justice League 2 off the schedule, but they still had several films that were already in some form of production that they had to somehow make the most out of. And Justice League, listen, there's going to be a whole episode on just what a debacle the overhaul of Justice League was and the baffling decisions that they made and how they disrespected our boy Superman in that movie. Just, there'll be a whole episode on each of the versions of Justice League. But suffice it to say that did not turn out well. That did not pan out. But before we got there was a glimmer of hope because there was a movie that came out under the Berg and Johns regime that did do really well. In June of 2017, just a few months before Justice League came out, that's when Patty Jenkins' Wonder Woman came out and gave everyone hope that maybe DC on film can be saved. Maybe all these characters needed was to be taken away from the original vision that they were introduced under. Because Wonder Woman was introduced in Batman versus Superman, Dawn of Justice. She was a fairly prominent supporting character in that. And she had arguably one of the coolest moments when she finally makes her premiere as Wonder Woman during the Doomsday Battle. So she's intrinsically connected to this Snyderverse stuff. And yet, her movie was the first of the DCEU movies that exceeded expectations at the box office and got great reviews. It was the first one. And mind you, this was with Patty Jenkins, who hadn't been with the project from its inception. Michelle McLaren had left. So Patty Jenkins gets the job in 2016 and delivers this marvelous film in June of 2017. And she did it. Look, there was Zack Snyder gets a story credit because he helped come up with some of the initial bullet points, setting it in World War I. And obviously he's the one who cast Gal Gadot, who he had wanted for DC for a while. She had even been up for Feora. He was going to try to cast her in Man of Steel as Zod's right-hand woman, Feora, but a scheduling conflict is what got in the way of that. So Zack had cast her, Zack had introduced her, Zack had come up with the initial bullet points of what her story will be, but Jeff Johns was able to get in there and work with Patty Jenkins with enough time and enough effort to make a film that really kind of stood apart from what we saw in BVS. It had a totally different kind of tone and feel and emotionality to it than anything we had seen since Man of Steel. It had been a few years since DC had presented us with something quite this wonderful. So Wonder Woman exceeded expectations, it surpassed box office projections, and it went on to make a very, very healthy profit. So the summer of 2017 made you feel like DC can do this. They could pull the nose up on this. These characters just need to be moved away from Zack Snyder. These characters just need to be moved away from the original way that they were depicted. And we just need to get away from the where they were going with that, because just DC, the main mass audiences were just not feeling it. But if we felt hope in the summer of 2017, we felt despair in the fall. Because while Wonder Woman had been the first DC film to exceed expectations, where the projections heading into the opening weekend were somewhere just around 65 million, maybe 80 million if we're lucky, that film ended up opening to $103 million. It exceeded and then just continued building from there because the word of mouth was positive, right? Justice League. The very first ever Justice League movie opened to only $94 million, Okay? Just for comparison's sake, this is supposed to be DC's answer to the Avengers. The Avengers had come out in 2012 to a staggering I want to get the exact figure, $207 million, and would go on to clear $2 billion along the way. Justice League opened to only 94 and would never even go anywhere near $1 billion, not even $500 million. Maybe $500 million, but like it didn't even touch it. So Justice League all of a sudden fell on its face. And if you want to go into theories as to why, listen, didn't Wonder Woman just kick off a great winning streak for us, and Wonder Woman is in this? Shouldn't we be all excited? On top of that, this is coming out a year and change after Jeff Johns and John Berg took over for DC. So this should be, a bright symbol and signal for the future. Where's all the goodwill? Here comes the goodwill, right? But unfortunately, there was no goodwill, because when you look at the marketing for Justice League, 99% of the footage that everyone was shown was Snyder footage. And the entire premise of the trailer, the entire premise of the movie is this is a direct sequel to Batman versus Superman. We're going to continue on from what you guys just saw, and Superman got killed off. And while Wonder Woman goes 100 years into the past and tells you a story that's disconnected from the stuff from BVS, this movie is the continuation of BVS. And at the time, mainstream audiences had no idea about Joss Whedon coming in and taking over and completely redoing the movie and all the sweeping changes. When that movie was released and promoted, it was released and promoted as Zack Snyder's Justice League. So therefore, when opening weekend came, we went back to that BVS feeling of people not being that into this. All of a sudden, remember how I said Wonder Woman exceeded expectations at the box office and was critically praised? Well, in this particular instance, despite all the overhauling and the rewriting on the set and the hasty reshoots and the insanity that went into making the movie, it still only got 40% on Rotten Tomatoes from the critics. So it was still considered a crap movie, even after all of that effort. So it was received as a bad movie, and it terribly disappointed at the box office. And who paid the price for that? Jeff Johns and John Berg. Even though the movie was already in production. They were not the ones who greenlit BVS. They were not the ones who greenlit going down this whole direction now, where we've brought in Doomsday and Superman's dead and we're trying to get to Darkseid. They hadn't been part of any of that. In fact, they tried their best to try to pivot and kind of go, instead of Darkseid and instead of the Snyderverse, we're going to introduce the Legion of Doom, and we're going to start bringing in iconic DC villains, and the next Justice League movie will be more like Justice League versus Legion of Doom, as opposed to the Darkseid stuff that Snyder had been trying to get to. So, they had tried their best to try to make that pivot and offer an alternate future for DC on film. But by that point, unfortunately, the damage had already been done. Because honestly, I kind of glazed over something. I glazed over that 2016 was an absolutely terrible year for DC on film. Because not only did BVS come out to that rough 29% and disappoint at the box office and have historic drop-offs and become meme-worthy for some of its creative decisions. Not only did that happen in March of 2016, but then in the summer, David Ayer's Suicide Squad is released. And while that film did much better in terms of turning a profit, because it didn't cost as much as BVS, and it didn't have the same stakes and as much counting on it as BVS, it only got a 26% on Rotten Tomatoes. And it gave this impression that DC on film is kind of a disjointed grim, dark, weird, trying to be edgy, but not really sticking the landing on anything kind of a franchise. So it was a 1-2 punch in 2016 that really hurt the brand, really hurt the prospects for DC on film. Because again, when you're following up BVS, which is your 29% movie, and your big follow-up is a 26% movie, we're not trending in the right direction. And DC is not creating this great, wonderful reputation with mass audiences. It's just not happening. You're giving people the sense that some of these movies are good, some of these movies are bad. The person who's steering the ship is taking the ship in a direction I'm not that interested in. And so DC on Film was really at a dire straits at the end of 2017. And so it was time for the next big executive shakeup. Because just a couple of months later, in January of 2018, that is when Walter Hamada was brought on, and he would eventually be the final executive overseeing DC as in its current form, where it was just a subdivision of Warner Brothers Pictures, and where the approach seems to be, we're going to hire you to be the boss. You're going to be the one who charts the course and makes all the tough decisions. But you still have to deal with the fact that these last few years happened and that these versions of these characters still exist. And we're going to have to just make the most of it. We're not going to reboot. We're not going to make a clean line of distinction between the Snyderverse stuff and the future. We're just going to try to limp forward after Justice League and present a new vision. And hopefully this new vision is going to slowly bring back trust in the DC brand. That's where the Walter Hamada era really kind of kicks off. And his very first thing was really just to kind of go radio silent for most of 2018. There were no new releases in 2018, which is honestly a real smart idea, because part of what had brought the DCEU train off the tracks was that when it launched, it was trying to do way too much at once. Right out of that gate, right out of when they announced the slate back in October 2014, they moved forward into production on all these different things. They started firing up all these different projects. So finally, for the first time, we were able to sort of hit pause in 2018 and just let's give people a year to kind of forget about the stuff that went on. The only movie coming out now is Aquaman, and it's coming out at the end of the year. Hamada is announced in January of 2018. Aquaman comes out in December of 2018. So they take that calendar year off, hoping, okay, we're going to try to, learn the Wonder Woman lesson, right? These characters can thrive just separate of the Snyderverse. And mass audiences did not know that Justice League was technically separate of the Snyderverse. They had no way of knowing that until later on, as more stories came out about exactly how much that film had been snatched away from Snyder's and wasn't really Zack Snyder's cut of the movie. We wouldn't get to see that one until 2021, and that'll be its own episode as well. The release, the Snyder Cut movement, and all that stuff, the twists and turns and trials and tribulations of that. But for 2018, now we are quiet for a bit until finally in December, Aquaman comes out. And that was the first DC film to be a $1 billion earner. This was an era where Hollywood was getting very accustomed to $1 billion grosses on their blockbuster franchises. Star Wars was routinely pulling in billions. The big Marvel crossover movies were routinely pulling in billions. But DC failed to do it through those first couple of years, despite very expensive movies, despite very high budgets, despite prestigious casts, despite everything. No DC movie crossed that much vaunted $1 billion mark until James Wan's Aquaman came out in December of 2018. And it once again proved the Wonder Woman theory correct. These characters can thrive under new creative guidance. Because the thing that's so fascinating about how Aquaman did was that it actually opened less. It opened under what everything before it had done. It opened to $68 million. It was by far the lowest opening for a DC film to date at that point. And yet, that $68 million grew to be north of $1 billion. You know how? Word of mouth. Positive word of mouth. That's what none of the other DC films prior to it had aside from Wonder Woman, where people saw it, had a great time, and told people, you should go check this out too. Even though on Rotten Tomatoes it was only marginally better, Aquaman pulled off a 65% on Rotten Tomatoes. So it was the best reviewed film after Wonder Woman. But still, 65 is not exactly this overwhelming, endorsement. Oh, this movie is an instant superhero classic. No. That is not what happened. But it made $68 million and then legged out over $1 billion because enough people saw it, loved it, told people to go see it, that's what happens. That's what you want a good movie to do. And Aquaman pulled that off. It gave us that hope again, just like Wonder Woman had, that maybe DC can flourish once more. And maybe Walter Hamada was really smart to kind of be quiet for all of 2018 and let these upcoming films do the talking for what DC on film is going to be moving forward. And yet, things were also kind of just confusing at this point, because even though it was clear that these characters could thrive separate of the Snyderverse, there were no other solo movies being developed for these Justice League characters at the time. For the foreseeable future, the future was now going to be, Shazam, Birds of Prey, a Matt Reeves Batman movie that is not connected, a Black Adam movie with Dwayne Johnson that's being developed by New Line, not Warner Brothers. Like, everything was still disjointed, but there was nothing about a Man of Steel 2. Even though Justice League Theatrical had brought him back at the end and positioned him in a way where now we could continue with Henry Cavill's Superman. And there had even been momentum behind a Man of Steel 2 around the time of Justice League's release. I remember reporting on it. I remember at that time I was more of a reporter than a commentator. I actually had sources. I had people in the business who would confide things in me, and I was trying to get more exclusive behind the scenes intel on stuff. And I remember there was a lot of movement around getting Henry Cavill a new Superman movie at the time, because there was a faction within Warner Brothers who felt like, look what Wonder Woman did. And look how actually, they couldn't predict how Aquaman was going to do. But there was this feeling that, no, these characters can still go on. And yet, after Justice League bombed, the decision was seemingly made to just move on from them. No Henry Cavill Superman movie announced. Ben Affleck was so disenchanted by his time as Batman that he no longer wanted to continue on as Batman at that point. So they couldn't announce a Ben Affleck Batman solo movie anymore, even though there had been, it had been announced and he had been talking about it. And he was actually sick to death of being asked about it because the script wasn't ready yet. And he kept telling journalists, please stop asking me about the Batman. I want to talk about it when there's a script. But again, Warner Brothers mismanagement, Warner Brothers inept executives had already announced his Batman movie and had already given a tentative release date. Because again, they were learning no lessons from these previous years. Warner Brothers has had its head up its own rectum for so long. And Affleck doesn't play with that. He doesn't work with that. He hated the fact that everyone wanted to talk about a Batman movie that didn't even have a script yet. That didn't even have, it was not ready to film. So why are you talking to me about this? He knew it was a mess. He knew that, like, the way that they're running things at Warner Brothers, this is all cynical corporate nonsense. They're trying to sell action figures and merchandise. They don't care about making these movies as good as possible. So after Aquaman came out and we had all this hope for what DC could be, nothing major was announced after that. Only smaller projects and disconnected, unrelated projects were announced. So Shazam came out a few months after Aquaman, but didn't get that bump. It had a nice critical response, but it didn't have a huge turning at the box office, and it wasn't this huge, big win for DC. After that was Birds of Prey, another one where the reviews were pretty favorable, and it once again showed Warner Brothers is willing to go director-driven again, and they let Kathy Yan and they let everyone making that film really express themselves and make the movie that they wanted to make. After years of Warner Brothers being so on top of their directors that people were just quitting left and right. But Birds of Prey also had barely, the box office was far from impressive. And then the next film after that was Black Adam. That was the next mainline DCEU movie that came out after Birds of Prey. Because in between, you had two very successful Elseworld tales that had nothing to do with the DCEU that had been established. We got the Batman, we got Joaquin Phoenix's Joker, but we didn't get anything else that was connected to the mainline DCEU actually until James Gunn's Suicide Squad. But again, that was another one that had you scratching your head, right? Because people didn't exactly flock to David Ayer's Suicide Squad in 2016. So it was really perplexing when James Gunn announces his DC project is going to have virtually the same title. He's just releasing a movie called The Suicide Squad, But that movie, it didn't exactly do well. And actually, I skipped one. I'm looking at the release dates now because I'm doing this as I'm recording. I'm looking at the release date. Yeah, we got Wonder Woman 1984 in 2020, but the issue with that was that it was during the pandemic. It happened, it was only for Max. It didn't get a theatrical release. So we'll never fully know how that film might have done because it was a pandemic release. And even with the Suicide Squad that came later on, that was released in theaters, but also simultaneously for free on Max, for Max subscribers. So with both of those, it's hard to make heads or tails of how to interpret them. And in the middle, you also had the re-release of Justice League. You had Zack Snyder's Justice League came out, and it did fairly impressive numbers on streaming platforms. But again, this was just a director's cut of a movie that had come out 4 years prior, and it was not going to suddenly bring the DCEU back to life. So really, life post Aquaman was very shoddy, very up and down, very disjointed. There was no clear vision for what DC on film was. There wasn't some kind of discernible winning streak we were on. There wasn't some big crossover event that we're building towards. They keep launching new DC shows on the Arrowverse and on the DC Universe app. DC was just getting more and more watered down and splintered down, and you'd hear about all these different projects. Oh, Ava DuVernay is developing New Gods, and Steven Spielberg is developing a Black Hawk movie, and somewhere Dwayne Johnson is still working on that Black Adam movie he's been talking about since 2014. DC on film just became a complete scattered nightmare for a few years. And even if you enjoyed the content, you had to see your team is losing. Your team, it's not doing well. Just to kind of make it feel almost like a sports analogy. If your team was DC, the years after Aquaman were very perplexing because you weren't getting any AAA movies out of your main favorite characters. You were just hearing about all these weird little offshoots. And Joe Manganiello is also developing a Deathstroke movie with Gareth Evans. And, everything was just all over the place. And it opened up the door for the need for a brand new overhaul in how things are being done. But I really feel like, the story of the DCEU can be told between Man of Steel and Aquaman. Those first 6 films really kind of like set the tone for why the DCEU never really reached its proper potential. And let's just go through just the numbers and the critical response, okay? Because I think it bears repeating. Okay, for Rotten Tomatoes, for all of the first 6, here were your scores: Man of Steel, 56%; BVS, 29%; Suicide Squad, 26%; Wonder Woman, 93%; Justice League, 40%; Aquaman, 65%. Okay? These are the 6 films with which the DCEU was established on. Okay? And look at what a dismal response, by and large, those films got. And then in case you want to go, but the critics aren't, the purveyors of all that is good. Critics can be wrong, let the fans speak. And that's where you have to look at the opening weekend box office numbers. Again, in order, the first 6 films. Man of Steel opened to $128 million. Very respectable. Its sequel, Batman vs. Superman, which now took Superman and added in an Academy Award winner as Batman. It added in the first ever appearance of Wonder Woman on screen and in a movie. It ushered in Doomsday and the Death of Superman storyline, which was spoiled in trailer 3 for the movie. Like, in promoting Batman vs. Superman, including that title, the whole thing was just a big marketing ploy to get everyone, come see this fanboy-centric blockbuster. This is what you've been waiting for. Here are all the big DC characters. We're setting up Justice League. This has hints of The Dark Knight Returns meets Death of Superman. Like they were trying to go full out. Full court press. Let's get geek culture fully bought into BVS. Let's practically give away the ending of the movie. Let's have a title that tells you, yes, our heroes are going to fight, but yes, of course, they're going to work together at the end. Let's just spoil the whole thing in the title and tell them we're making a Justice League movie. And it only made $166 million in opening weekend. That's a $38 million improvement over Man of Steel. Considering everything that had been thrown into it, 38 mil more, not a big vote of confidence. And then a couple months later, you have Suicide Squad, which opened to 134 million. So now the numbers have gone down, but that one did leg out a decent bit of profit because it didn't have the enormity of the stakes or the grossed out opinions people had about BVS. There was a lot of people who just thought, why would you have these two fight? I hate this. What was that Martha moment? This Superman is so unlikable. You already killed off Doomsday. Like, a lot of people felt really strongly with BVS. Suicide Squad didn't have a lot of that baggage because for a lot of people, Suicide Squad was a fresh concept. It was a neat, novel idea. You get a bunch of villains together and you put them on these death-defying missions because Superman's dead and we need somebody to fight the extraterrestrial major villains that are coming because Superman's not here. We don't have a Justice League yet. So the Suicide Squad concept was sound. It opened to 134. It legged out a nice profit somewhere in the mid 700 mils, and it didn't cost as nearly as much as BVS had. So we'll consider Suicide Squad another soft win. Then the next one was Wonder Woman with 103, where again, you'd think, oh, that hurts. That's $31 million less than Suicide Squad. But that one legged out a very, very nice profit. It had the 93% on Rotten Tomatoes, and it actually had that positive buzz, that positive word of mouth that you want a film to have. Then the next one was Justice League with the 94 mil. And we've already discussed what a terrible number that is for the historic first ever uniting of the Justice League on the big screen. And then finally, Aquaman with the $68 million that was able to leg out $1 billion total when all was said and done. Within those 6 movies is the whole tale of the DCEU. By the time we got through Aquaman, it seems that audiences had already made up their mind as to what they were going to bother with and what they were not going to bother with. And what we would find out was they were not going to bother with any Snyderverse type stuff. And they were not going to bother with these lesser known characters like Shazam and Birds of Prey. They really wanted to see the big heroes show up. Look how they supported Wonder Woman. Look how they supported Aquaman. I bet you that if Ben Affleck had stuck around and made his The Batman movie, I'm sure that would have done really well. I'm sure if Henry Cavill's Man of Steel 2, with perhaps Christopher McQuarrie directing it, which he wanted to do, Christopher McQuarrie and Henry Cavill were having conversations about Superman on the set for Mission Impossible Fallout. Like, Walter Hamada could have made that happen, but it didn't happen. So a lack of vision and a lack of leadership, followed by executives making a series of the most terrible decisions you could make for a franchise, ultimately left the DCEU mismanaged to death. And by the time we got post-pandemic, by the time we got to what DC was meant to be in the years after all the big overhauls and all the big executive changes that happened, we were now looking at a DCEU where the films were Black Adam, Shazam, Fury of the Gods, The Flash, Blue Beetle, and Aquaman 2. That was going to be what was coming up. And that's what brought us to the fall of 2022 and the absolute need for the official death of the DCEU, as well as the official birth of DC Studios. Because in the fall of 2022, in a final bit of executorial mismanagement by Warner Brothers, they released this Black Adam movie. And look, I enjoyed Black Adam for what it was. It was just an empty, fizzy, empty calorie blockbuster that had some feel-good moments. And, there was some potential there for what Black Adam as a concept could be. But let's face it, it wasn't a very good movie. And it wasn't very well thought out. And it opened to 39% on Rotten Tomatoes. So we're once again looking at a film that was not well received. And then its opening, it's fascinating. The opening for that film, it opened to almost the same exact number as Aquaman had. Aquaman opened to 68 mil. Black Adam opened to 67 million. But while Aquaman eventually cleared $1 billion, Black Adam didn't even crack 400,000. It stopped at 400 million. It stopped at 393 million bucks because it was no good. It was not considered a great film. And the reason I refer to executive mismanagement is that despite this clunky, corporately manufactured, generic superhero movie, being what they have to offer us, the executives at Warner Brothers okayed bringing Henry Cavill back for a cameo at the end of that. Walter Hamada did not want that. Walter Hamada moved away from Henry Cavill. He did not want to continue down the Snyderverse path. He had set the course that we need to kind of break from everything, and we're going to use the Flash to reset, and we're going to introduce a Supergirl, and we're going to bring back Michael Keaton's Batman, and we're going to try to just completely rejigger the Justice League as we know it. But then Walter Hamada got replaced because Pamela Abdy and Michael DeLuca suddenly became the babysitters for DC on film, while a new owner David Zaslav was looking for who was going to be the permanent boss of DC. So while he was doing an executive search for who was going to be his Kevin Feige for DC, Pamela Abdi and Michael DeLuca okayed this harebrained Black Adam plan where we're going to bring back Henry Cavill's Superman despite years of letting him grow ice cold, and we're going to throw him in at the end of this crappy Black Adam movie, and we're going to use this crappy Black Adam movie to set up a Black Adam versus Superman, which we know is just going to end up the same as Batman versus Superman, right? Because he's not going to kill Black Adam. And Black Adam isn't going to kill Superman. And we know that Dwayne wants Black Adam to be more of a badass anti-hero type. So what's going to happen? The same thing that happened in BVS. They're going to be mad at each other. They're going to have a fight. And then they're going to work together to fight a bigger threat. So this was the big plan. You know what I mean? These executives had no idea what they were doing. But on the backs of a crappy Black Adam movie, they wanted us to get excited for a Man of Steel 2, a Black Adam versus Superman situation, a Justice Society movie. Like, they were once again repeating the same mistakes that executives had been making for years, which is just promising a bunch of movies on the back of something that people are not enthusiastic for. And just hoping if we just keep throwing enough effort and money and millions and energy at this, people will magically get excited again. It wasn't working, okay? Black Adam bombed, it wasn't well received, and therefore DC Studios was born. And now we need to talk about why DC is not going to be in crap hands again. We are now going to be saved of this kind of executive mismanagement because of the terms that James Gunn and Peter Safran have negotiated for their time as DC. Because they're not going to do what Walter Hamada did. They're not going to do what Jeff Johns and John Berg did. They are not going to try to breathe life into a dead concept. They are going to actually do what the scary thing is, which is we're going to start from scratch. We know that you've all been watching us try our best to make DC work on film. We know that you fans all have opinions about how well or how poorly we've done, but we're just going to keep on throwing energy at it and hoping you forgive us one day. No. James Gunn and Peter Safran had the courage to go, what is happening now isn't working. Rather than continue to try to resuscitate this corpse that died years ago, we're going to bury it and we're going to start something new. We're going to build something new on that, and move completely away from what was once there. And, you might think, oh, but what's different? How is this going to be any different than the DCEU was? They changed executives several times. There were lots of promises and slates made in the past. And while I did tackle a long form version of this answer in episode 2 of this podcast, I want to just go more specifically into the biggest difference here. Okay? They have a vision. They have a plan, and they have a vision right out of the gate. James Gunn has already made it clear that, yes, we may have announced that there's many different projects that we're currently developing, but we're not announcing release dates. We're not giving green lights to anything until the scripts are in dynamic shape, and nothing is going to get made until it has our absolute seal of approval. And for the first time ever, there's going to be one centralized office overseeing all of DC. The movies, the TV shows, the animation, the video games, rather than have this be a subdivision of Warner Brothers Pictures. We're going to form a completely separate, independent film studio from Warner Brothers Pictures. And we only answer to David Zaslav. We only have one boss, and he's the guy who begged us to do this job. So they have a certain level of autonomy and a certain level of there's confidence in them from the man up top. And they don't have to deal with Warner Brothers harebrained executives making terrible ideas for them, making terrible suggestions and trying to take DC on more strange rabbit hole detours. DC Studios does not have to appease Warner Brothers Pictures. They only have to deal with Warner Brothers Pictures, Abdi and DeLuca, to work out, the release dates. And work out, how we can make our film slate work with the overall Warner Brothers film slate. Because Warner Brothers will still, distribute the movies. They're responsible for distributing them. So you're going to see that Warner Brothers logo at the start of every project that's coming. But producing them is now 100% an in-house DC Studios thing. And all of it. Everything you're going to see on a screen is coming from DC Studios. This has never, ever, ever happened before. And while the DCEU was just like a rotating door of creatives coming in and out with new executives every couple of years, promising different bits of IP to different creators, and everyone coming in with totally different kinds of ways that they want to tell their DC stories. We've got one central team that has mapped out the beginning, middle, and end of the entire story that DC Studios wants to tell. There's that thing that James Gunn has referred to several times now, what he calls the biggest story ever told. And what he has claimed is, over at Marvel, while he was working there, he saw that they were basically reverse engineering their universe. That when phase 1 came out, there wasn't some bigger plan necessarily past the Avengers. And a lot of what they were doing, they were figuring it out as they went. They were doing little minor course corrections, and they were bringing on creatives who had great ideas for where this could go down the line. And eventually they got their vision and they got their stuff worked out, and they built to Avengers Endgame. And listen, they achieved the ultimate success that anyone in Hollywood has ever had with this concept. But they did it by the seat of their pants. And in certain ways, it's almost like they got lucky that they were able to kind of fudge certain things and change certain details without anyone minding too much and without anyone noticing, oh, that's totally not where that was originally going. But okay, James knows that that's how Marvel did things because that's how he experienced it. He worked there. He's been on the inside of the Marvel machine. And he has said that this time around, the biggest story ever told is already mapped out. They know all the finer points of the story, and everything else is just going to be fleshing it out and making sure that every project works in service of the larger narrative. That is something that the DCEU never had. You went from in the beginning, this is a Snyder joint, to this is a Berg and Johns joint, to now, never mind, there is no one main creative thing. Now every director just gets to do whatever they want joint after 2019. There's never been that coherent, cohesive, consistent vision for what DC is supposed to be. DCEU was just like a buffet with 25 different things on the menu. And oh yeah, I'll take a little lo mein next to my chocolate pudding and next to my meatloaf. Like everything is all over the place. And now at last, we've got one central vision for what DC across all on-screen media is going to be. And he's not just doing it by himself. This is not the Gunverse, as he has said, and as I shared in a quote over on the Twitter, on Superman on Film. He wants directors to be able to imprint and leave their own identity on their projects. He was given a certain amount of creative leeway with the Guardians of the Galaxy movies. That's why you could tell those were always a slight different. They were a cut above most of the Marvel films that came out around them. And it's because he was allowed to put his James Gunn touch on things. And he wants the directors that get hired to be able to put their touches on things. But they have to buy in to the overall vision and the overall story so that we're all working at this from the same vantage point. We're all coming at this from the same direction and we're building to the same goal. And as such, you've got James Gunn, you've got Tom King, the wonderful comic book writer who's written some amazing stuff and was working with James Gunn even before he got the official job. You've got Crystal Henry, who worked on the phenomenal Watchmen series. You got Christina Hodson in there, who worked on, would have been the superior version of the Flash movie, as well as Birds of Prey. You've also got Drew Goddard. You know how everyone's all excited about Daredevil's return, right? Daredevil over on Disney Plus. Daredevil Born Again is about to come back because everyone has such a soft spot for the Netflix Marvel Daredevil series. That's a Drew Goddard thing, okay? He developed season 1 and then had to hand it off to Stephen DeKnight. But Drew Goddard is the original architect for the Marvel Netflix Daredevil series that everyone is all excited for. And he's also involved with the DCEU. And you've got Jeremy Slater, who worked on Moon Knight and is probably the least impressive of the names on the list. But right out of the gate, Gunn has put together a team of creatives, a writer's room, to flesh out Chapter 1, Gods and Monsters, as well as what is presumably going to be Chapter 2. We don't know the name of what Chapter 2 is going to be, but he's got a team of people who've mapped out what this entire universe is going to tell, the story that this universe is going to tell, and the goals that this universe has. That clear vision, that direct path that they want to follow, that is something that the DCEU never had. There was never that level of collaboration and cohesion. It just, it didn't happen. And that's why, we have to hope that everything stays the way it's going to be. If Warner Brothers does get sold, is there a possibility that a new owner would come in and try to mess with what DC Studios is working on? Of course, that kind of thing can always happen. But as long as the projects are going well and are turning a profit, who in their right mind is going to mess with what DC Studios is doing? If somebody else does come in and buy Warner Brothers Discovery, they're going to look at all the different divisions and they're going to make cuts and changes to the ones that aren't living up to potential. But if DC Studios, starting this December, starts living up to potential, if Creature Commandos is a reasonable hit, if Superman next summer does for DC what Iron Man did for Marvel back in 2008, where it introduces you to the core central pivotal character of this new universe and gets you excited for where things are going next, there's no way that a new boss is going to step in after that and go, yeah, but never mind. Hey, what's Henry Cavill doing? Or where's Zack Snyder right now? There's no one's going to mess with the current plan. And Warner Brothers, the people who used to love messing with the current plans, they're not involved. Gunn and Safran do not answer to Warner Brothers Pictures. They only answer to Zaslav. So Warner Brothers' involvement on all of this is so minimal. And that honestly gives me I feel such peace knowing that nobody at Warner Brothers is allowed to tell James Gunn how to make his DC movies. Thank you. After years of you guys and your terrible ideas, we're done with that. We're done with that era for DC on film. So look, I was going to include a full preview of Chapter 1, Gods and Monsters. But honestly, we talked so much today about everything else that's gone on, this entire history lesson, the cautionary tale of what happened with the DCEU versus what we hope will happen with the DCU. We've been doing this for so long. This is going to be almost, we're going to be closing in on almost 2 hours on this episode. So I will save the previewing of Chapter 1, Gods and Monsters, for a later episode. But for now, let's just go ahead and bring it right back to the original thesis here. DCEU versus DCU, Dawn of the Future. Look, the DCEU gave us some great times. There were some wonderful moments in some of those early films. Some of our heroes have never looked more breathtaking or more grandiose and mythological than they did in those first 6 DC movies, first 6 DCEU movies. But ultimately, mismanagement behind the scenes, the lack of a vision, the lack of a real plan, and the lack of the courage to follow through on plans that they've already announced ultimately killed the DCEU. So may it rest in peace. From again, I'm not going to count 2013 because Man of Steel wasn't really it. For me, the DCEU really begins in 2014 when they announced that huge slate and new directors and everything. You know, in 2014 for me is really when it happened. So DCEU, may you rest in peace. You had a good run. 2014 through 2023 when Aquaman 2 came out. That was your period of time. And thanks for the ups. No thanks for all the downs. But ultimately, thank you for bringing us to the DCU and the dawn of the future. Because I do think the future is bright. I do think now with a real plan, with a real nice combination of creative people from the comic book world, from the film world, from the TV world, all working together as a team, I think we're finally going to get the DC on film that we've all been begging for many, 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 many years now. So hopefully you enjoyed episode 6 of the Superman on Film podcast. Be sure to like, rate, review, subscribe, tell your friends, spread the word. And as always, I like to read the reviews that come in. So I got a new review this week. And this one is from user on Apple Podcasts, user Clark's Creek. Clark says, super analysis of the past, present, and future. Mario is doing a super job of analyzing the past, present, and future of Superman cinema. I have tremendously enjoyed listening as he has broken down the evolution of Superman on the big screen and the ways in which each movie has impacted and led to the next in weaving the tapestry that is Superman on film. I am thrilled to have this new podcast to accompany me in my excitement in the year leading up to the release of James Gunn's Superman and hopefully for many subsequent years after that. Well, Clark's Creek, just so you know, yes, many years into the future is the plan for this here show. Because even though right now the big countdown is 47 weeks to James Gunn's Superman, but that's just going to lead to the next countdown. Because when that film comes out, we're going to be around 49 weeks away already from Supergirl. So for me, this may be a Superman on Film podcast, but anything of or pertaining to Superman, his family, Kryptonian characters, that is all fair game for this podcast. So while year 1 is going to focus in on the countdown to James Gunn's new film, there is going to be a lot more Superman goodness to cover in the years to come, especially if the DCU really does hit and we start finding out what more projects are coming out, because I have a feeling there's more for David Corenswet's Superman than has been announced. Because that chapter 1 of the DCU, the Gods and Monsters, you know, it is only said to be roughly half or possibly less than half of the projects that are planned for the DCEU right now. The DCU right now. So that means I think there are some other projects that are going to come out that they're playing very close to the vest. Perhaps things with bigger, more AAA characters, things that are a little more team-uppy, things that are building more towards the big event films that they don't want to announce yet. But I have a feeling we're going to see a lot of David Corenswet's Superman in the years to come, with or without a solo sequel. So yes, there's going to be a lot to discuss Clark's Creek. There's going to be a lot to discuss anyone else who's coming on board now for this brand new show. Still can't believe we're only 6 weeks in, and the feedback has been great. I am still the top hit for Superman on Apple Podcast in a sea of dozens and dozens, if not hundreds, of Superman-centric podcasts. This show is number one, and that's because of you. So thank you. Let's keep the love going. And until next week, life is chaos. Be kind. Up, up, and away.